At a time when people worldwide are being forced from their homes, we bring you the timeless story of Kentuckians forced from their homes through eminent domain to make way for Mammoth Cave National Park. The poignant telling of this tale comes to us, and it comes to life through the locally produced documentary Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home, that we are very proud comes from WKU-PBS. It's the story of those who went willingly and others whose lives were inexplicably changed by the condemnation of their land. A Place Called Home, Mammoth Cave, and Eminent Domain, up next on Outlook. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're so glad you joined us. You know, we Kentuckians were known for our sense of place and for our connection to the land. WKU-PBS is pleased to premiere the locally produced documentary, Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home. We're going to show that on WKU-PBS during our March membership drive. And of course, at the end of the show, we'll tell you those dates and times so you won't miss it. But it's A Place Called Home, and it's the story, it's a really interesting story of how Mammoth Cave came to be. So without further ado, let's welcome to the program three individuals who know a lot about Mammoth Cave. We are joined by Cheryl Beckley, who is the producer of this locally produced documentary. Thanks for being here, Cheryl. And in addition, Vicki Carson, who probably should be employed here because of all that she helps us out with. Vicki Carson and Dave Wyrick. Vicki is the Public Information Officer with Mammoth Cave National Park, and the Chief of Interpretation and Visitor Services is the hat that Dave Wyrick wears. But you're not wearing the hat today.
Not wearing a hat today.
But it's there. Let's talk a little bit about something we call eminent domain, and it's interesting that we're bringing you this story because the National Park Service is celebrating its centennial in August of 2016. So there's a lot of attention being paid to national parks. Mammoth Cave. When did all this begin? This idea that this is an interesting plot of land. Let's make a national park.
Well, Mammoth Cave has been a tourist attraction for 200 years now, and we're celebrating that anniversary as well this year. We think organized cave tours started in 1816. So it was privately owned and operated for many years. And by about the turn of the century, by around 1900, its operation wasn't quite what it used to be. Some of the facilities were running down. And a gentleman named M.M. Logan made a proposal to the Congress at that time.
Was he a legislator?
He was, and he was from Edmonson County, and he was a senator for the state, and at one time the judge executive in Edmonson County. And he proposed that Mammoth Cave become a national park at that time, and it was a new idea. The Park Service hadn't been formed yet.
And quite a bold move, don't you think, on his part,
yes,
M.M. Logan?
Yeah, and it really didn't get much play then, and it came up a few more times. But then, along in the 1920s, Congress, after the Park Service had been formed in 1916, most of the parks were in the West, and Congress asked for a study to be done. You know, in the federal government, we do studies.
Yes.
We study things.
It's a good thing.
And so in the 1920s, there was a study done to look for locations in the East that might become national parks. And so at the end of that study, 3 areas were chosen: the Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah, and Mammoth Cave. And Congress said, well, these would be great national parks, but we don't have a budget to purchase these lands. So if the states would give these lands to the Congress, to the federal government, they could become national parks. And so each of these parks were formed in the same way.
In the same way, and then they implemented something called eminent domain, and this is something, you know, that is still very much a part of life today. I mean, it's still used in many different ways. We've got the definition as it reads, but the power of a government to take private property for public use without the owner's consent, provided just compensation is given. And in large part, that's what you found, Cheryl Beckley, as you decided this was a great story to tell. Talk a little bit about the genesis of how that came to be. Of course, if you're familiar with our television station, Cheryl and Vicki worked diligently on the hour-long documentary, Mammoth Cave, A Way to Wonder. But you decided this would make a good story, like a good follow-up story.
We did. After talking to Vicki, and over the years, after we finished A Way to Wonder, these stories kept coming up. You know, the generations that were pre-park have slowly died, and we're losing a lot of these stories. And we thought, we need to do this because it's such an important story. 600 families were displaced with the creation of the park, and those stories are important stories that need to be told because they have a legacy to the land there. A lot of the families were there. They came after the revolution, and they have a land grant, they're moving in, this is our farm, this is our farm for 150 years. Those stories need to be told. And with the celebration of the centennial of the Park Service, 75th anniversary of the park, this was the time to do it.
And when I tell people about this story, because stay tuned, because we have some beautiful stories to share with you. We're going to kind of whet your appetite to watch the whole documentary when it premieres. But it's not always a happy story. As you mentioned, people, 600 families were displaced from their land. So, that might beg the question, you still want to tell that story?
Well, yes.
Yeah, we have, part of the Park Service has come to realize that what we need to do is tell the story from multiple points of view. And to make that connection with folks that had a rough time doing it, and during this period of time, and with folks that really benefited from it too. So it's really important for us to tell both sides, and lots of times in history it's a one-sided story.
That's very true. Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home. We're telling you the story of the upcoming documentary that's going to air and premiere here on WKU-PBS in March in a couple of weeks. And we're going to take a short break here on Outlook, but when we come back, we'll hear two of those stories. One that worked out really well, the other not so well. Stay tuned. Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us. We've got a great story to tell you today because that's what we do here at public television, local public television. And we're very excited to be premiering a locally produced documentary, Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home, during our March membership drive coming up a little bit later in the month. But right now we're going to we're going to whet your appetite with some of these stories. Vicki Carson and Dave Wyrick join us. They're with Mammoth Cave National Park, and Cheryl Beckley, the producer of the documentary, joins us as well. Before the break, we were talking about how Mammoth Cave became a national park, and it all dates back to the 20s and 30s. We also brought up that word, those two words, eminent domain, which was used in large part to obtain some of the land. So just very briefly, if you can, help us understand how 600 families had to be moved to make way for the park.
Well, at first there was an organization called the Mammoth Cave National Park Association, and they began the process of acquiring land and getting promises to sell. And they were offering, I think, $50 per acre, which was a very good price.
Well, put it in context, yeah, because we're talking about the 1920s?
Yes, but then the Great Depression came, and the association couldn't pay that price, and people were not willing to sell, but there was still this effort to make it a national park, and so the state of Kentucky stepped in and formed the Kentucky National Parks Commission, and that was how eminent domain was used through the state of Kentucky.
Now, Cheryl, in making the documentary and working so closely with the people at Mammoth Cave National Park, you also have to weigh, like you said, Dave, you wanted to tell the story from all sides because there were a lot of different people affected. We're going to meet some people here right now, the Lees, in just a moment.
Alice and Daniel Lee. Daniel Lee was actually born pre-park, lived on the park until he was 9 years old, and his family actually had a business that had everything to do with the park. It was the home-like inn. People could stay in their home, they could stay in the cabins that they had, and then they would go just a few miles down the road and they were in Mammoth Cave. And that was something that had been in their family for a really long time. And when eminent domain was used to take their home and their land and everything that was around it, they had to move. They lost a business, they lost their home. But Daniel Lee, at 9 years old, he was thrilled with the fact that they had indoor plumbing and he had friends he could play with, because when at the Home Like Inn, there was nothing around There was nobody for him to play with.
Suddenly he was moved to the Horse Cave area and,
Oh.
and met new friends. Let's hear from the Lees now. Take a look.
Well, I remember it very well. I was born, of course, the 27, and then we didn't move out until about 1938. So I was 9 years old when we moved out, and I do remember living in the park or in the Mammoth Cave area. We had a tourist camp, my folks did, called Home Like Inn. We had 6 cabins and 2 rooms in the house that were rented out. So we were the closest tourist court to Mammoth Cave at that time. And that was 1.5 miles from the entrance of the cave to where we lived. Then we moved out in 1938 to move into Cave City. The land that we owned was condemned to be turned over to the National Park. Well, it was pretty rough on the family, but I thought it was great because we had an indoor toilet. But other than that, it wasn't much different. I mean, we had a lot more friends in Cave City, and it was a totally different lifestyle, but I enjoyed it. And after I'd been there for a few months or a year, I wouldn't leave it. I mean, it was great.
And we heard from the Lees. That's just one of the many stories that are contained in the locally produced documentary by WKU-PBS and Cheryl Beckley called Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home. We're premiering it on our station later in the month, but we thought it would be a good opportunity to share it, kind of whet your appetite and tease you and hope that you will tune into it. Vicki Carson, Dave Wyrick join us. They're with Mammoth Cave National Park. So that was one story of a family, of a gentleman who's still around and remembers that time when his life was changed inexplicably because he was moved because their land was taken to make way for Mammoth Cave. Not all the stories are so happy.
No, you know, we talked to several family members of people who had lived on the park, you know, for generations, and you know, especially the older generations had a tough time when they were moved. That insular community that they had there, they depended on each other, and really, when that was torn apart, they did not do well. When they moved to Louisville, when they moved to, you know, Bowling Green, when they moved to Brownsville, when they moved to these other places, those communities were torn apart, and that support system was gone.
You know, Vicki, you were talking about the fact that eminent domain, all of a sudden these people were being offered $50 an acre, and then the Great Depression came, so that didn't happen. So that made a delay in making Mammoth Cave a national park. The park superintendent at the time, Robert Holland, Joe Ridge, and Vernon Wells. And Vernon Wells, we have some audio from him telling the story, but this is a very poignant story. We never know the name of this gentleman who was displaced, but kind of set it up for us, but don't give it away, if you will, and what we're going to see here in just a minute.
An interview was done for a project here at Western Kentucky University with this gentleman, Vernon Wells. He was one of the very first park rangers, and he and his partner, Joe Ridge, actually had to help move people off of the park. The land had been sold, they had been paid, but people had been told that they could stay on the parkland. They didn't, you know, basically for the rest of their lives. That was untrue. It was never true. Nothing was ever written. It was a gentleman's agreement. And when the Park Service came in, they actually had to fulfill moving these people off. And Vernon Wells felt really, really bad about having to do this, but it was his job. And they had this one particular gentleman, older gentleman who'd lived on the park all of his life. They had to move him. And so they had contacted his daughter, who wanted her father to move in with her, to, you know, please have him come for a visit. And when he visited,
The rest, as you will see in this piece, is just this poignant story. Take a look.
So we found out, though, that he had a daughter who lived up in Horse Cave, and she had been for some time trying to get him to move. He was pretty well up in years. They'd come and live with her, but he refused to do it. He said he was going to stay there. So we conspired with his daughter to take him to her home for a visit one day. And while he was gone, We took a crew of 3 Seaboys from number 1 camp and a bulldozer over there, and we demolished that house. So when he came back, there was not anything there but a pile of lumber on the ground. Of course, he was very, very irate about the thing, and I'm sure he would try to kill us if we'd been around. But Mr. Holland was a very, very determined person, and it was his job to get this thing, to get the thing moving down there. And when he saw, after he'd been there a year or so, saw that it was impossible to move quickly in any other way, why we had to resort to these forcible tactics in order to get the land vacated. Otherwise, Mammoth Cave National Park would have been many, many years after that in becoming a reality.
That was the late Vernon Wells recounting in an oral history the story of having to take people's land to make way for Mammoth Cave National Park. We're previewing the upcoming documentary on PBS called Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home, locally produced by Cheryl Beckley, the producer who's joining us. Vicki Carson, Dave Wyrick join us. Before we take a break and go into our third segment, Vicki, you brought up a great point. We're profiling the story of Mammoth Cave, but this story in general is not unique.
No, well, Dave, you were saying part of your family.
Yeah, my grandfather was displaced from Eddyville when that became a lake.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, reservoirs or when roads are created. In Kentucky, we have so many reservoirs, so there must be so many stories like this, you know.
And this is just, you know, one little snippet of these stories, as you mentioned. It's called Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home. We're premiering it here on WKU PBS later in the month, but we've got a lot more to tell you about this great story and how so many visitors, 1 million visitors a year, visit Mammoth Cave National Park. We're going to talk more about that and the legacy it leaves right after this. Stay with us. Hello, you're watching Outlook here on WKU PBS. I'm your host, Barbara Deeb. And today at the round table, we are having a discussion about Mammoth Cave National Park. As the National Park Service celebrates its centennial, we are bringing you the locally produced documentary, Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home. And that's going to be later in the month. And of course, at the end of the show, we'll tell you when you can tune into that. Vicki Carson, Dave Wyrick are joining us from Mammoth Cave. In addition, we have Cheryl Beckley, the producer of that documentary. So before the break, we were talking about how Mammoth Cave became a national park, and 600 families were displaced to make way for the park. We saw some of those stories, and you'll see a whole lot more when you tune in for the documentary. But as it stands right now, we talked about nearly 1 million people annually visit Mammoth Cave National Park. You are the chief interpreter, if you will, of that. What does that mean for you?
Well, it means that we have 1 million people that learn the story of Mammoth Cave. They go out and I think they're touched by the diversity of the stories that come. I mean, our story really begins with the Native Americans, and so we have different programs that we do that try to touch on all the aspects of Mammoth Cave and where it started from the very beginning, even geologically, and to where it is now. So it's a vast story that we have to.
It is, and it goes on and on. But in this modern day, in this crazy technologically driven society, you still have over 1 million people who want to go and visit a national park and have a moment with nature.
Yes, well, and you know, many times we hear, I mean, every day we hear somebody say, I came here as a kid, you know, and I wanted to bring my kids, or I wanted to bring my niece and nephew, or I wanted to bring my grandkids back, you know, to see this place. And it made an impression on them, you know, something about the cave, maybe the darkness of the cave, or the quiet of the cave, or just the mammothness of the cave. Yes. Or maybe it was Green River, you know,
yes.
a time on Green River, or hiking in the backcountry, or just up and down the hills and hollows and the sinkholes and the springs. It's a beautiful place.
Everybody's looking for something different, and they find it there. It just, whether it's on the surface or below the surface.
I love that.
2 parks for the
Right.
price of 1.
Yes.
Two parts on the surface or below the surface.
Yes.
That's right. So this locally produced documentary, Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home, is telling the story of how Mammoth Cave became a national park. We talked about around 600 families being displaced. We saw one story kind of happy, the other not so happy, and yet these are stories that need to be told. In the end, it's the legacy that it leaves.
It is, and one of the things that we wanted to do with this, I mean, these are sad stories, people being moved off their homes, the loss of community, the loss of farms, the loss of a legacy to a family, that had been on this land for 150 years. That legacy still exists in Mammoth Cave National Park. Those stories still exist in Mammoth Cave National Park, and they're shared not only statewide, nationwide, but worldwide.
But worldwide. And Johnny Meredith, who works with Mammoth Cave National Park, well, he says it best. Let's take a look at that.
I would say the greatest legacy that those individuals have left, that is remembered, is every single day that we're open. It's the land itself, the sacrifice they made. They just gave it up for the whole world to come and see. And now, hundreds of thousands of people a year, millions of people since we've become a park, have come here and connected to the land also. And they found their own meanings.
And so while around 600 families were displaced to make way for Mammoth Cave National Park, you see that the legacy lives on as nearly 1 million people visit the park each year, over and under, to experience it. We're just about out of time. Cheryl Beckley is the producer of the documentary upcoming on WKU-PBS, Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home. Vicki Carson, of course, the public information officer. Dave Wyrick, the chief of interpretation at the park. So you know what? Vicki, I'm going to give you the last word. Why is it important for this legacy to continue, and why is it important for these stories to be told, heard, and appreciated?
Well, over a year ago, we started thinking about how are we going to celebrate our anniversaries. And we decided we wanted to look back and look at the context of each one. And in talking with Cheryl and knowing that we both knew this story was out there waiting to be told, we thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to help people understand, to really capture a moment in time when all this was taking place and look at it from all sides. And one thing we have found about history, and I guess all historians know, is that it's not a static thing. It's pretty dynamic, and we have large questions still at the park that are unanswered, that we're hoping someone will find in a trunk someplace, in an old letter, in a
fill
journal.
in the gaps.
Yes, and
fill in the
so
gaps.
in this way, we have a piece of history now that we didn't have before.
There you go. And that history is called Mammoth Cave, A Place Called Home, a locally produced documentary that you'll see only here on WKU-PBS. Thank you so much for sharing this story. Vicki Carson, Dave Wyrick, and producer Cheryl Beckley. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. We're glad you joined us.